On the morning of my 70th birthday, my daughter Cassandra showed up at my door with a folder full of wedding plans and a demand that would change everything between us. No happy birthday, Mom. No hug. Just cold numbers on expensive paper and a voice I barely recognized saying, "I need $45,000 and I need it by next month." She'd been planning this wedding for 2 years, she said, and everything was already booked. The venue, the flowers, the photographer who'd shot 3 celebrity weddings in Monterey. I told her I didn't have that kind of money lying around, not since the medical bills from Eleanor's Alzheimer's treatment had drained our savings. Cassandra's face hardened like concrete. "Then figure it out," she said, sliding a payment schedule across my kitchen table in our little house on Willow Creek Drive. "Because I'm getting married with or without your support." I thought that was the worst part. I was wrong. What I discovered 3 weeks later would turn my world upside down and prove that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you'd die to protect. And that was only the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The folder sat on my kitchen table for 3 days after Cassandra left, taunting me every time I walked past it. The morning light streaming through the blinds of my small ranch house in Pinehurst seemed to catch the burgundy cover at just the right angle, making it gleam like something precious or dangerous. My name is Margaret Hartwell, and at 70 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could serve up. I buried my husband Charles when I was 58. I held Eleanor's hand through 6 years of Alzheimer's, until she forgot my name entirely. I've weathered financial struggles, health scares, and the particular loneliness that comes with being the last woman standing in a family that used to fill a dinner table. But nothing had prepared me for the stranger who showed up at my door wearing my daughter's face. Inside that folder were 47 pages of wedding details, each one more extravagant than the last. Ice sculptures shaped like roses, a 12-piece orchestra for the reception, imported champagne that cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries for a month. The venue was listed as Ocean View Manor in Carmel, a place I'd only seen in magazine spreads about celebrity weddings. I'd raised Cassandra to understand the value of money. When she was 10 and wanted an American Girl doll, I made her save her allowance for 4 months and contribute half the cost. When she was 17 and dented the family Honda backing out of a parking space, she worked at Dairy Queen every weekend for 3 months to pay for the repairs. So where had this woman come from? This person who expected me to liquidate my retirement savings for 1 day of celebration. Eleanor would have known what to say. My wife had always been the diplomat in our family, the one who could smooth over disagreements between Cassandra and me with her gentle wisdom and homemade apple pie. But Eleanor had been gone 18 months now, and I was still learning how to navigate conversations that used to have 3 voices instead of 2. The house felt too quiet without her. No more humming from the kitchen while she cooked. No more soft laughter at her television shows in the evening. Just me, the ticking grandfather clock Charles had restored in 1985, and the weight of decisions I'd never had to make alone. I picked up the phone and called my neighbor, Ruth Coldwell. Ruth lived 3 houses down on Willow Creek Drive, in the blue Victorian with the rose garden that made the rest of us look like amateur gardeners. We'd been friends for 22 years, ever since we'd both moved to Pinehurst seeking small-town peace after raising our children in the chaos of San Francisco. Ruth's daughter had gotten married the previous fall, a lovely ceremony at the Pinehurst Community Center with wildflower bouquets and a potluck reception that the whole neighborhood had contributed to. The entire event had cost maybe $4,000, and it had been one of the most joyful celebrations I'd ever attended. $45,000. Ruth's voice pitched higher over the phone. "Margaret, that's more than I paid for my car. That's more than most people spend on a year of college tuition. She says everything's already booked. Non-refundable deposits. Did you ask to see the actual contracts? The booking confirmations? I paused, realizing I hadn't. The folder contained glossy brochures and itemized price lists, but now that Ruth mentioned it, I couldn't recall seeing any official booking documents. Just Cassandra's word that the money needed to be in her account by the 28th of next month. Ruth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Does this sound normal to you? The amount, the urgency. Ruth was quiet for a moment. I could hear her kettle whistling in the background, the sound of a woman who still made real tea in a real pot, instead of nuking water in the microwave, like I'd started doing since Eleanor died. Honey, she said finally, I've known you for over 2 decades. You're the most practical woman I've ever met. If your gut is telling you something's off, then something's off. Trust yourself. After I hung up, I made myself a cup of instant coffee and sat down with the folder again. This time I read every page carefully, making notes on a yellow legal pad that had been sitting in my junk drawer since Charles used to balance our checkbook by hand. The venue cost alone was listed at $22,000. The catering was another $15,000. Flowers were $9,000, for flowers that would be dead in a week. Photography was $8,500. The dress, which according to the paperwork was a custom creation by some designer in Los Angeles, was listed at $6,000. I stared at those numbers until they started to blur. In my entire life, I'd never owned anything that cost $6,000, except the cars Charles and I had bought together. The idea of spending that much money on a dress that would be worn for a few hours seemed not just wasteful, but obscene. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone again. This time I called Cassandra's fiancé, Marcus Chen. I'd met him exactly 3 times at Christmas dinner the year before, at Eleanor's funeral, and at a brief lunch last spring when Cassandra had announced their engagement. He seemed like a decent young man, quiet and polite, with the kind of steady demeanor that reminded me of Charles in his younger days. Mrs. Hartwell, Marcus answered after 2 rings. His voice sounded tired, strained. I was wondering when you might call. Marcus, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Are you comfortable with a $45,000 wedding? The silence that followed stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Marcus cleared his throat. Mrs. Hartwell, I thought we were keeping the budget under $12,000. That's what Cassandra and I discussed when we got engaged. We agreed we wanted something simple, something we could pay for ourselves without going into debt. My stomach dropped like I'd stepped off a cliff. 12,000. Yes, ma'am. Cassandra mentioned that you wanted to contribute something, which we appreciated, but we never talked about. He trailed off. Mrs. Hartwell, how much is she asking you for? I told him. The silence that followed was even longer than the first one. That doesn't make sense, Marcus said finally. We looked at venues together last month. The Pinehurst Community Center is available for our date, and it only costs $300 to rent for the day. Cassandra said she liked the idea of having the reception there because it would be more intimate. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing all the air out of my lungs. Marcus, when was the last time you and Cassandra talked about the wedding details? 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. She said she was handling most of the planning, because she enjoys that kind of thing, and I was happy to let her. I've been swamped at work with the quarterly reports. Marcus worked as an accountant for a small firm in Monterey, the kind of job that paid well enough to support a modest lifestyle, but certainly not enough to fund a $45,000 wedding. Has she shown you any contracts, any booking confirmations? No, but I assumed. Another pause. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm starting to get a bad feeling about this conversation. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the folder with new eyes. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the living room, marking time the way it had for 35 years, indifferent to the fact that my world was shifting beneath my feet. I opened the folder again and found the contact information for the vendors. Ocean View Manor in Carmel was listed first, with a phone number and email address printed on elegant ivory cardstock. It was just after 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon when I dialed their number. Good afternoon, Ocean View Manor. This is Victoria speaking. How may I assist you today? The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of refined accent that suggested this wasn't the sort of place where people argued about prices. Hello, Victoria. I'm calling to confirm a wedding booking for June 20th. The name would be Cassandra Hartwell. I heard the soft clicking of computer keys in the background. One moment, please. Let me check our calendar. More clicking, then a pause. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see any bookings under that name for June 20th. In fact, we're completely booked for that entire weekend. We've had a waiting list for June dates since last November. My mouth went dry. Are you certain? Maybe it's under a different name. The groom is Marcus Chen. Let me double check. More typing. No, I'm not seeing anything under that name either. Would you like me to check if we have any availability later in the summer? I mumbled something about calling back and hung up, my hands trembling as I set the phone down. One by one, I called the other vendors listed in the folder. The photographer who supposedly specialized in celebrity weddings had never heard of Cassandra Hartwell. The florist who was meant to provide $9,000 worth of imported roses had no record of any order. The caterer who was going to serve a 7-course meal to 200 guests had no contracts on file. By 6 o'clock that evening, I'd confirmed what my instincts had been screaming since the moment Cassandra had walked into my kitchen. There was no $45,000 wedding, at least not the one described in the folder. I made myself a scrambled egg for dinner, though I could barely taste it. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what I'd discovered. If Cassandra wasn't planning the elaborate wedding described in the folder, what did she need $45,000 for? I thought about Marcus's confusion, his certainty that they'd planned a simple $12,000 celebration. I thought about the professional-looking brochures and price lists in the folder, the level of detail that suggested weeks or months of preparation. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment deception. This was calculated, deliberate. That night, I barely slept. I kept getting up to check the locks on my doors, though I couldn't have said why. The house felt different somehow, like the walls were holding secrets I didn't want to know. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in the bedroom I'd shared with Eleanor, looking at the framed photo of Cassandra on the dresser. It was from her college graduation, 10 years ago. She was wearing her cap and gown, beaming at the camera with genuine joy. Her eyes were bright and clear, full of hope for the future. I picked up the photo and studied it in the dim light from the hallway. When had that bright-eyed girl become the hard-faced woman who'd sat at my kitchen table, demanding money for a wedding that didn't exist? The next morning, I drove to First National Bank in downtown Pinehurst. I'd been banking there for 25 years, long enough that most of the tellers knew me by name. I asked to access my safety deposit box, something I hadn't done since Eleanor's funeral, when I'd needed her will and insurance papers. Inside the box were the usual documents: birth certificates, the deed to the house, Eleanor's jewelry, and something I'd almost forgotten about, a manila envelope marked Cassandra's wedding fund in Eleanor's careful handwriting. We'd started that fund when Cassandra was 16, setting aside small amounts whenever we could. Eleanor had insisted that every girl deserved to have a beautiful wedding, even if her parents couldn't afford to pay for it all at once. Over the years, the fund had grown to just over $18,000, money we'd invested in conservative bonds and CDs that had earned modest but steady returns. Attached to the envelope was a note in Eleanor's handwriting, for Cassie's special day, whenever that may be. All our love, Mom and Mama E. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for a long time, holding that note. Eleanor had always called Cassandra Cassie with such tenderness, such unconditional love. She would have been devastated to know that her beloved Cassie was now trying to manipulate and deceive the people who loved her most. But Eleanor had also taught me to be strong, to trust my judgment, and to protect what mattered. And right now, what mattered was finding out what Cassandra really needed $45,000 for. That afternoon, I made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I drove to Cassandra's apartment complex on the other side of Pinehurst, a modern development called Sunset Ridge that had been built 5 years earlier. Her unit was on the second floor of Building C, with a small balcony that overlooked the complex's swimming pool. I didn't plan to knock on her door. I just wanted to see if she was home, maybe get a sense of whether she was struggling financially in ways she hadn't told me about. But as I sat in my car across the parking lot, Cassandra's front door opened. She wasn't alone. The man with her was older, probably in his mid-40s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of expensive casual clothes that suggested money. He was tall and handsome in a practiced way, like someone who worked hard to maintain his appearance. They stood close together on her small balcony, and there was an intimacy in their body language that made my chest tighten with a familiar dread. This wasn't Marcus. I watched from behind my steering wheel as Cassandra laughed at something the man said, throwing her head back in a way that reminded me of her teenage years. She looked younger with him, more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. The man put his hand on the small of her back, a gesture so casual and possessive that it spoke of a long-established relationship. They kissed before he left, not a peck on the cheek but a real kiss, the kind shared by people who knew each other's bodies well. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I waited until the man drove away in a black Mercedes sedan before starting my own car. My mind was reeling with questions I didn't want to ask and answers I didn't want to hear. When I got home, I called Marcus again. Marcus, it's Margaret Hartwell again. I need to ask you something, and I promise I'm not trying to interfere in your relationship. When was the last time you saw Cassandra? Sunday evening. We had dinner at that Italian place on Main Street. Why? Mrs. Hartwell, you're starting to worry me. And things seemed normal between you two. I thought so. She seemed a little distracted, maybe stressed about the wedding planning, but nothing unusual. Mrs. Hartwell, what's going on? I almost told him about the man at her apartment, about the kiss I'd witnessed, about the fake wedding bookings. Instead I said, I think we need to have a conversation with Cassandra, all three of us together. Can you ask her to come by tomorrow evening? Of course. Should I be concerned about something specific? Just ask her to come by around 7. And Marcus, don't mention that we've been talking. After I hung up, I went out to my small backyard and sat on the wooden bench Charles had built under the old oak tree. It was the place I came to think, to remember, to try to make sense of things that didn't want to make sense. Cassandra was having an affair. That much was clear, but was she planning to leave Marcus for this other man? Was the wedding money meant to fund a new life with someone else? Or was there something even darker going on? Something I couldn't yet see. The sun was setting behind the neighbor's fence, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Eleanor had always loved. I closed my eyes and tried to remember my daughter as a child, the little girl who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them sunshine flowers. When had that innocent child become someone capable of such elaborate deception? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Cassandra's name. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, trying to keep my voice normal. "Mom, I was wondering if you'd had a chance to think about what we discussed." The money. She was calling about the money. "I'm still considering it, honey. These things take time to arrange." "I understand, but I really need to know by Friday. Some of the vendors are getting antsy about their deposits." The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that it made my skin crawl. This was my daughter, the child I'd raised, taught to be honest, held when she cried over broken hearts and failed tests. "Cassandra, would you mind coming by tomorrow evening? Around 7. I'd like to go over some of the details with you." A pause. "What kind of details?" "Just some questions I have about the vendors, the timeline, that sort of thing. And Marcus should probably be here too. Don't you think?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound different." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just trying to be thorough. This is a big financial commitment, and I want to make sure I understand everything." "Okay," she said finally. 7 o'clock tomorrow. I'll call Marcus." After she hung up, I sat in the growing darkness and wondered how a woman could spend 70 years thinking she knew her own daughter, only to discover she'd been living with a stranger all along. Inside the house, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with the burgundy folder open in front of me. I took out a fresh legal pad and wrote what I know at the top of one page and questions at the top of another. Under what I know, I wrote the wedding bookings are fake. Marcus knows nothing about the $45K. Request Cassandra is having an affair. She needs the money urgently. Under questions, I wrote who is the other man. Does Marcus know about the affair? What does she really need $45K for? How long has she been planning this deception? I stared at those lists for a long time, and then I added one more question that made my heart ache. How much of the daughter I thought I knew was real, and how much was just another performance? The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking the end of another day in a life that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Tomorrow, I would confront Cassandra with what I'd discovered. Tomorrow, I would demand the truth. But tonight I sat alone in the house where I'd raised her, surrounded by the ghosts of better times, and wondered if some betrayals cut so deep they could never heal. Outside, a car drove slowly past my house, its headlights sweeping across my living room wall. It paused for a moment, as if the driver was looking at something, then continued down Willow Creek Drive into the darkness. I got up to check the locks on my doors, though I still couldn't say why. The night felt different somehow, charged with possibilities I didn't want to consider. In a few hours, I would learn that my instincts had been right to warn me. The folder full of lies was just the beginning. What came next would test everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the lengths people will go to protect their secrets. But for now, I sat in my quiet house and tried to remember the sound of Eleanor's laughter, the warmth of her hand in mine, and the way she used to tell me that everything would work out in the end. I hoped she was right. I hoped there was still time to save what could be saved, and the wisdom to let go of what was already lost. The clock ticked on, indifferent to hope and fear alike, carrying me toward a tomorrow that would change everything. The next evening arrived with the weight of inevitability. I spent the day cleaning my house, not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands, while my mind raced through what I was going to say to Cassandra and Marcus. At 6:45, I made a pot of coffee and set out 3 cups on the kitchen table next to the burgundy folder that had started this whole mess. Marcus arrived first, punctual as always. He looked nervous, his usual calm demeanor replaced by the fidgety energy of someone who sensed trouble but couldn't identify its source. "Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for having me over," he said, accepting a cup of coffee. "Has Cassandra said anything to you about what this meeting is about?" "Not exactly," I replied, which was technically true, but I think we'll all understand more once she gets here. Cassandra arrived 10 minutes late, which wasn't unusual for her. What was unusual was the way she looked, tired, almost haggard, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. She kissed my cheek perfunctorily and settled into the chair across from Marcus. "So," she said, forcing a smile, "what's this all about, Mum?" I opened the burgundy folder and spread some of the vendor information across the table. "I had some questions about the wedding plans, sweetheart. I wanted to make sure I understood all the details before I make such a large financial commitment." Marcus leaned forward, studying the papers. "Wow, Cassie, when did you put all this together? This looks incredibly detailed." Cassandra's smile flickered slightly. "I've been working on it for weeks. You know how I am about planning. It's impressive," I said carefully. "So impressive, in fact, that I decided to call some of these vendors myself, just to confirm the arrangements." The color drained from Cassandra's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Marcus, still focused on the papers, didn't notice. "And," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "well, that's the interesting thing. Ocean View Manor has never heard of you, neither has Elegant Occasions Catering, or La Rosa Florist, or Timothy Williams Photography." I kept my voice steady, matter of fact. "In fact, none of the vendors listed in this beautiful folder have any record of bookings under your name." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked up from the papers, confusion written across his face. "What? That doesn't make sense, Cassie?" Cassandra opened her mouth, then closed it. For a moment, she looked like the scared little girl who used to run to me when she'd broken something and didn't know how to fix it. "There must be some mistake," she said finally. "Maybe they have the bookings under Marcus's name, or I checked that too," I interrupted gently. "I also asked Marcus about the budget yesterday. He was under the impression you two had agreed on $12,000, not 45. Marcus turned to stare at his fiancée. "Cassie, what's going on? Why would you tell your mother we needed $45,000? Cassandra's composure cracked completely. Tears started streaming down her face, and for a moment I felt the familiar maternal instinct to comfort her, to make everything okay, but I forced myself to stay seated, to wait for the truth. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." "What did you never mean to go this far?" Marcus asked, his voice rising. "Cassie, you're scaring me." Cassandra looked at me, then at Marcus, then down at her hands. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet we had to lean in to hear her. "I'm in debt, serious debt. Credit cards, mostly, and some other things. I owe almost $50,000. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus actually rocked back in his chair. "50,000, he whispered. "How is that possible?" "It started small," Cassandra said, still not looking at either of us. "Just a few purchases here and there. But then I lost my job at the boutique last year, and I couldn't make the minimum payments, so the interest kept piling up, and then I took cash advances to pay some of the cards," and she trailed off, but we all knew how that story ended. The mathematical inevitability of compound interest, the way debt could grow like cancer if left untreated. "But you've been working," Marcus said. "You got that job at the marketing firm 6 months ago." Cassandra finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "I lost that job too, 3 months ago. I've been pretending to go to work every day because I didn't know how to tell you. My heart broke a little more with each revelation. This was why she'd looked so tired, so strained. She'd been living a lie for months, maybe longer. The man I saw you with yesterday, I said quietly, at your apartment. Who is he? If I thought Cassandra couldn't get any paler, I was wrong. Marcus whipped around to stare at me, then back at his fiancée. What man? He demanded. His name is Richard Blackwood, Cassandra whispered. He's been helping me with the debt situation. Helping how? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. He's a loan broker. He specializes in helping people consolidate their debts into more manageable payments. He said he could help me get a single loan to pay everything off, but I needed to come up with 10% down as a good faith payment. So you thought you'd get it from me, I said, by pretending you needed it for a wedding. Cassandra nodded miserably. I thought if I could just get the money and pay off the debt, I could figure out how to pay you back over time. Richard said he could get me approved for a loan that would let me clear everything and still have money left over to actually plan a real wedding. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Cassie, please tell me you're not talking about what I think you're talking about. Please tell me you haven't gotten involved with a loan shark. The look on Cassandra's face told us everything. He's not a loan shark, she said defensively. He's a legitimate businessman. He has an office and everything. I felt a chill run down my spine. Sweetheart, legitimate loan brokers don't require 10% down payments. They don't make house calls to pretty young women's apartments. And they definitely don't charge the kind of interest rates that would require you to lie to your family to get the money. You don't understand, Cassandra said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. I don't have any other options. The credit card companies are threatening to sue me. I could lose my apartment. I could lose everything. You could lose more than that, I said grimly. These kinds of men don't just go away when you can't pay them. They escalate. Marcus had gone very quiet, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't name. Finally, he looked at Cassandra with an expression that was equal parts heartbreak and disgust. How long? He asked. What? How long have you been lying to me? About the job, about the debt, about... Marcus, please. How long, Cassie? 8 months, she whispered. Maybe 9. Marcus nodded slowly, like he was processing information he'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. Then he stood up and walked to the kitchen sink, staring out the window at my backyard. I can't do this, he said quietly. I can't marry someone who's been lying to me for 9 months. Someone who would try to defraud her own mother to pay off debts to dangerous people. Marcus, wait. Cassandra jumped up, reaching for his arm. He pulled away gently but firmly. No, Cassie, this isn't just about the money. This is about trust. This is about the fact that instead of coming to me when you were in trouble, instead of asking for help, you chose to lie and manipulate and drag your mother into whatever mess you've created with this Richard person. He turned to me. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you had to find out about your daughter this way, and I'm sorry she tried to use you. You deserve better. With that, he walked to the front door. Cassandra followed him, pleading, but I could hear the finality in his voice when he said goodbye. The sound of his car starting and pulling away from the curb seemed to echo through the entire house. Cassandra came back to the kitchen, sobbing openly now. She collapsed into her chair and put her head in her hands. I've ruined everything, she cried. Everything. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the manipulative stranger who had demanded money from me, but a scared, foolish young woman who had made a series of increasingly desperate decisions and now found herself trapped in a web of her own making. Yes, I said quietly, you have. She looked up at me, startled by my bluntness. But, I continued, ruined doesn't have to mean the end. It can also mean the beginning, if you're willing to do what it takes to rebuild. Over the next hour, we talked more honestly than we had in years. I learned about the shopping addiction that had started the debt cycle, about the shame that had kept her from asking for help, about the way Richard Blackwood had made promises that sounded too good to be true because they were. The next evening arrived with the weight of inevitability. I spent the day cleaning my house, not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands, while my mind raced through what I was going to say to Cassandra and Marcus. At 6:45, I made a pot of coffee and set out 3 cups on the kitchen table next to the burgundy folder that had started this whole mess. Marcus arrived first, punctual as always. He looked nervous, his usual calm demeanor replaced by the fidgety energy of someone who sensed trouble but couldn't identify its source. Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for having me over, he said, accepting a cup of coffee. Has Cassandra said anything to you about what this meeting is about? Not exactly, I replied, which was technically true, but I think we'll all understand more once she gets here. Cassandra arrived 10 minutes late, which wasn't unusual for her. What was unusual was the way she looked, tired, almost haggard, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. She kissed my cheek perfunctorily and settled into the chair across from Marcus. "So," she said, forcing a smile, "what's this all about, Mom?" I opened the burgundy folder and spread some of the vendor information across the table. "I had some questions about the wedding plans, sweetheart. I wanted to make sure I understood all the details before I make such a large financial commitment." Marcus leaned forward, studying the papers. "Wow, Cassie, when did you put all this together? This looks incredibly detailed." Cassandra's smile flickered slightly. "I've been working on it for weeks. You know how I am about planning." "It's impressive," I said carefully. "So impressive, in fact, that I decided to call some of these vendors myself, just to confirm the arrangements." The color drained from Cassandra's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Marcus, still focused on the papers, didn't notice. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, that's the interesting thing. Ocean View Manor has never heard of you. Neither has Elegant Occasions Catering, or La Rosa Florist, or Timothy Williams Photography." I kept my voice steady, matter of fact. "In fact, none of the vendors listed in this beautiful folder have any record of bookings under your name.